Simon, in Lake Grove, New York. I've heard the stories about the WrestleMania 3 attendance and the name Zane Breslov mentioned. Can you talk some about who he was exactly and what he did for WWE? Yes, Zane Breslov was originally he was a rock and roll promoter. And I think he started his own, I think he had his own promotions company in the 80s, like the early 80s. And I wanted to get all the details right about this. I can give you sort of an overview of who he was and what he did, but he rarely gets talked about. And I don't know when I'll have the chance to talk about him again. So I pulled together some specifics from some newspaper articles and such, because he really was a very important player, not only for WWE, but later on also for WCW. And he became a real confidant of Eric Bischoff. But the earliest mention of him I could find in wrestling was actually one line of text in the Wrestling Observer from December 30th, 1985, that just read, Zane Breslov, a local rock promoter, is now in charge of promoting the Midwest. That's all it said. And thus, he was introduced to the world of professional wrestling. He had moved to Denver, and that's probably as much as anything what got him his job with WWE. He would call them constantly trying to get hired. Finally, they said, look, we're having a tough time booking the Denver Coliseum to show WrestleMania on closed circuit. And 5 minutes later, Breslov called him back and said, you're in. Just like that. Because back then, WWE, they used a lot of local promoters because these people knew these markets better than Vince McMahon did. They had local connections that WWF needed. They knew the local news media and how to get WWE promoted in these markets. So they relied on these local promoters. And they had people like Zane Breslov. They had people like Jack Tunney. Yes, Jack Tunney. He was a regional promoter for Vince McMahon, which is probably what got him the role of the figurehead president on television in the first place after all those years. I grew up a WWF fan thinking Jack Tunney was the president of the company, and you only saw him when there was a reason to, when there was something big going down or there was a big announcement to make. Then you would see Jack Tunney's face pop up on TV. He wasn't on television every week like he would be today. Today, Jack Tunney would be in 7 segments on the show. He'd be a heel. They would train him. He'd be wrestling a match. This is the way that it would be today. But yes, Jack Tunney was the same thing. He was an actual promoter. The WrestleMania 3 stuff has taken on a life of its own over the years. WWE has always publicly claimed 93,173. That's how many fans were inside the Silverdome for WrestleMania 3, and that set a brand new indoor attendance record, which was actually broken later that same year by the Pope. He had mass inside the Silverdome. I think it was only by a few hundred people he beat out WrestleMania. But the 93,000 number is a disputed number. Except for the people who hate Dave Meltzer's guts, they won't believe a word he says. And really, this originates with Meltzer, so if it's a very polarizing issue. But it is a disputed number. And the number is said to have been around 78,000. Meltzer says he was told by Zane Breslov, who he used to talk to all the time. Breslov promoted the event. He helped promote the event, and he faxed Meltzer paperwork years later that showed 78,500 as the actual number. People don't realize that for years, the Observer reported the 93,000 number as fact. They didn't second guess it. So there was a period of 5, 6, 7 years where whenever the subject would come up in the newsletter, it was reported as 93,000. It wasn't until many years later, in like 92 or 93, I think, when he was having a conversation with Breslov. And Zane said to him, he goes, "You still believe that number?" And then he faxed over some kind of ticketing document that showed the lower number, the official number. I have to assume Meltzer doesn't have that document anymore, or else he would have produced it by now to shut everybody up, but he hasn't. So you have a lot of people who think he's full of shit and don't believe him. We'll never know for sure. To say that, we can be 100% sure, we'll never know for sure. Because look, for all the people that would say that about wrestling writers and dirt sheet writers, I also would be very skeptical of statements like that made by WWE. Because if you don't think they don't embellish numbers, They embellish wrestler weights when they come out on television. They invent entire backgrounds for some of these people. You don't think they would embellish an attendance figure? You don't think they've done it almost every year since? But, we'll never know for sure. Unfortunately, we can't ask Zane Breslov about that because he was killed years later in a car accident. He was driving his SUV in the mountains, and he rolled over. He rolled the car over. It threw him from the car. He had to be airlifted to the hospital. He was in a coma for about a month before he died. This was in 2003. It was a horrible way to go. He died on his 33rd wedding anniversary. But he was actually the local promoter for the very first UFC, UFC 1. Because he did more than just wrestling. Remember, he had his own company. So he was the promoter for UFC 1. I mean, what are they up to now? 241, I think, is their next show, right? Cormier and Miocic? Breslov promoted the very first UFC show, which was in Denver. That's probably why he was used. This was either right before... I'm trying to think if it was before he started working for WCW. It could have been while he was working for WCW. He might have been promoting both. I found an old newspaper article written by our old friend Alex Marvez of AEW fame. An article that Marvez wrote about Breslov in 1999 that claimed that he defected to WCW the same time Hulk Hogan did, which would have been 94. But I'm almost positive he started with them in 93. And when he did, he completely turned around their live event business. And he helped get them into buildings that they previously could not get access to because of all the relationships that he had. He was able to get them into those buildings. He was the person who came up with the idea of hosting Nitro parties. Remember those? When Nitro was kicking Raw's ass every single week and it was the hip, cool show, they would have fan-hosted Nitro parties in different places, different parts of the country, and I think they would have a camera there. They would send like a camera crew, and you would see these like college-age kids, having a blast, watching WCW. The whole concept of Nitro parties was his idea. He was the guy who pushed to have the talent sort of appear in person whenever they would have these ticket on-sale dates to try to sell as many tickets as they could that first day when they would go on sale. And it was his idea to hold the very first Nitro in the Mall of America. He thought it would be unique. It would be outside the box. So he pitched the idea to Eric Bischoff, and Bischoff loved it. Said, let's do it. Bischoff was always on the phone with Breslov. This guy, Steve Harms, is his name. He used to work with Breslov at his promotions company, and he's written about him online over the years. He's written about Zane and what he meant to him, and almost like a tribute to him. And he said that Eric would call him every 15 minutes during Nitro. Nitro or Thunder would be on the air, and Bischoff would call Breslov every 15 minutes just to see what Zane thought about the previous segment. That's how highly Eric thought of this guy and his input. He said Zane didn't have a lot of friends, he said, but the ones he did have, he treated them like gold. He was an interesting character. This guy Steve said that he would call him Insane Zane. He's a very unique personality. So I'm glad that you asked me about him because his name rarely gets mentioned. I know I've mentioned his name on the show before, but you really never hear his name mentioned. And I couldn't even find a picture of him online. I was looking around. I typed in Zane Breslov and every other combination I could think of, just trying to find out what this guy looks like. And I just could not find a picture of him anywhere. I have no idea what he looks like, but people should know what an important role he played both in WWE and WCW.